Thanks to everyone. I'm Sharon Constançon, CEO of Genius Boards and Genius Methods. And this is our Nugget series, which is half an hour. And sometimes if conversation allows us, we go on a little bit longer, just to pick up a very, very specific, minute part of something quite critical and go into it in a fair amount of detail. What I want to talk about today is bias and influence. What is quite important for us to understand is what brings us to the certain decisions that we get to. How do we get to our decisions? And to recognize potential failings in that process so that we can improve on it and make better decisions. Yeah, it's so easy for somebody to get down a narrow path, be set on an outcome, have their own views, and not be open to what else other people have got to add to it, or thinking of alternative inputs and listening to the external environment as well. So what did we learn last week? Last week, we understand that we are human beings. We are influenced by content, our environment, our learning. So therefore, by definition, we are at risk of being biased. We are a function of what we've experienced in life, what we've known, what we've been taught, what we've studied, what good and bad experiences that we've been through. And we also learned that human beings like to complicate things. And I think the other key learning we picked up last week was how people operate at different pace and different speeds. And that is important to understand when you're working in a complex business environment. It's not everybody can necessarily operate at the speed you could do. So today we're going to look at what are some of the quick and easy toolkits that we can apply to help us to negate the influence that might be at play, or our own influence that might be impacting our decisions. So at least we get to the stage that we are not in a position to go through life thinking that we are not biased. What we've got to do is find out, how do we prevent ourselves from being biased, recognize our biases. I was chatting to somebody yesterday and they were talking about bias. They say, yes, I'm always biased. When a person of a specific background applies for a job, I am automatically predisposed to that kind of an individual. That's fine. You recognize it, you know about it. So you can then deal with the bias. So it's being aware and being self-aware that is so important. So looking forward to today, recognizing the biases is, we can't easily see it in ourselves, but we can very easily see a bias in other people. And that's where we can help each other. And that's where in a team environment, we can be very supportive of those who are behaving or responding to bias, to think that bias through. We all have blind spots. We all don't see certain things, that either because we've just never come across them, never experienced them, or don't want to experience them. So it can fit into a number of categories as to why we have blind spots. It's not a negative thing. It's something we need to be cognizant of. And if we do something about it, we can actually deal with it. So that's the important part to come out of that discussion. Many do not recognize what the influences are that are the various biases that we can be impacted by. So in the session we're going to do next week, we're not going to address all 180 biases because you'll be bored by bias. You'll be overrun by bias. But what we'll pick on are the most common ones that impact us in a business environment. And a lot of those are very, very personal to us. But let's pick that one up in next week's lesson. Teams, if you think about it, you've got more than one person. You know that you are already influenced externally and by yourself. And now you have got a team of you around the table with equally those two sets of bias. So you can think what the matrix is doing of things that can be influencing making the right decision. And one of the things we're going to talk about in the session after that is, how do we deal with the difficult decision and the bias because the decision impacts a human being? And this is the one that we see companies fail on the most easily, because they just find it very difficult to deal with something that has got to do with someone else. So I remember doing a talk in Guernsey about 10 years ago, probably. And we were talking about what would you do if the chairman were a problem and the board had to at some point make a decision on what to do about the chairman. I had another circumstance working with the board evaluation about 4 or 5 years ago, and the sort of messaging that was coming back is the chairman had run his course in terms of the value add to the organization. So we're coming across two examples of probably the most difficult decision a board has to make is if their chair or chairman is not appropriate for the board. And on both occasions, everybody stood back and said, can't make that decision. So the non-decision, which is equally a decision, was the route of least resistance, the one that they didn't have to say, I've made the decision or I'm accountable for the decision. But the non-decision has exactly the same repercussions and outcomes as saying, we are going to keep the individual. The non-decision is exactly the same as, yes, we're going to keep the individual, which is a decision. And it was interesting how people really battle with that. And we'll cover that in the week after next, because it's such a critical one and I come across it so often. And if you think of this matrix of influences that are coming to a table around a particular topic, you could actually understand why we have this sort of statement that we make is that committees make bad decisions. You can actually get it because you think of it, the logic of it, there's a lot of information there that is going to get in the way of people making the right decision. And if we talk about people one, which we'll pick up in 2 weeks' time, if you think of what's been happening in the US recently, there's a lovely example of that too. Teams need to be mindful of those biases and share them and talk about them. But one of the things we notice is that human beings get so unbelievably sensitive around being noted of the bias that they are experiencing, accused of the bias if somebody's being that negative. And as a result, it breaks down the conversation. So how do we use our EQ to say, are you aware of you being biased by it? Why do you think that? Where's that influence coming from? So the toolkits can provide you with a very comfortable process rather than us having to deal with a uncomfortable situation of asking questions to try and get people to register their bias without them getting upset. We talk about the risk of a non-decision. It is so easily done. And we see this quite often in public sector, in charity type of environments. In the business world, you will see it quite differently, where a director or a chair or a CEO will be a lot clearer in, this is not working, we have to get this fixed, we need to take the next step. Whereas in some of these other environments, their training and the cut and thrust of making things work come up with the non-decision more regularly. The processes that we're going to put in place to protect the organization, there are a number of them. If we had to go through all of them, we'd also be here for another 10 sessions. So we're not going to do that. So what I'd like to do is just use one of the frameworks, which I think gives you enough key points that when utilizing them, it gets us in the right direction of at least asking the right questions. So this one is it was in a Harvard review. It's 12 specific questions, not too difficult to get yourself around, but it's broken down to 3 sections, which once again makes it easier to get through the questions in a non-emotional manner, as we talked about. First of all is to ask yourself a few hard questions. This might be the most difficult point to start, but if we don't ask ourselves, are we being influenced in any way, we're not going to get any further. Next point is ask the recommender. So the person putting forward the idea or the company, the question, what is it that's coming to you on which you are making a decision? And how can you ask the right questions that way around to get yourself the assurance that there isn't incorrect assumptions, bias, influence that might be coming within the project? And the other one is to actually ask about the proposal or the project directly. So it's actually to get more facts and then be able to make some of those assessments yourself without being influenced by the information you might be getting from others. So it's very important to go through these few steps. So if we look at the questions we're going to ask, let's run through the 12 questions. Self-interested biases. Am I going to make more money? Am I going to get a better job? Am I going to get a higher title? Will this be something that is going to float my agenda? Am I going to lose my job as a result of doing what's right by the company? What are the things that are going to impact me directly? And what are my personal agendas that are at play? So these are probably the most difficult ones. I've given you some examples of the kinds of things that might influence you in the decision you're making. And this is, I think, probably the highest risk one, and interesting, the first question of the 12 that are given, but it's trying to identify what yours are. Now, next week, we're going to go through the biases, and I'd like us to come back to this question and pick out those that are of self-interest so that you can make yourself a further toolkit, which will list the personal ones that you can then focus in on, because they are the ones that are going to impact you the most easily and the ones least recognizable by you, but recognized by your colleagues. One of the things they haven't actually mentioned here is actually to ask your colleagues to tell you whether they think you're biased. Actually ask a colleague. I would. I mean, that would be the thing to say. Do you think I'm biased? Most of them probably, if you're more senior, wouldn't say a word in case you fire them for the information they've just given you. But that's where we have to become more open and more receptive of information to improve ourselves in business. The other one is check for heuristic effect. Have we fallen in love with the project? Are we trying to get to the end because that's what our day job is, to get to the end and to get to a decision or to get to a solution? You know, all those kind of things. Have we fallen in love with it? Have we forgotten to start thinking critically, thinking with an open mind, challenging and questioning? Have we become effectively almost given ourselves a blind spot that is sitting there that could be impacting us in some way? And there's some tough questions that we need to ask in terms of, you know, is this my pet project? Is this going to make a difference to the next job? Is this M&A, is it going to make such a big difference that, you know, all these things that can impact us. And the other one is to check for groupthink. If everyone in the room thinks it's a good idea, have you done the 12 angry men question? Have you said, but have you thought of? Would a reasonable person consider this? And if you go back to the movie from back in the 60s, I think it was, how a whole jury got turned around because it was not beyond reasonable doubt. So always think the same way they did, the way Henry Ford did at that time, is to actually think. Just ask yourself the difficult question. Give yourself time to think about what you've just asked. And sometimes you might think, I'm not totally comfortable, or this is helping support my decision in whichever way it might be. So those are the personal questions, and probably the most difficult ones, because you are biased in the process. And how do you undo that bias while you're asking yourself about bias? Asking the recommender, this is much easier. These are the how, what, why, when. You know, it's the logic, it's the assumptions, testing their assumptions. It's much easier to ask somebody else questions and to listen to the answers. And you did hear what I said, listen to the answers. People fire off questions quite readily, but they don't always listen to the answers. And that's why it's very important that we do make a point of listening to any information we get given and clock it, give it a value, see how important it is, ask more questions. One of the things that I thought of as a topic when I was working on this over the weekend is how to have a conversation, which is an exercise I spent with the board a while back, a PE firm. None of their individuals knew how to have a conversation. They knew how to have an argument, but they didn't know how to have a conversation. So it's one of the things we're going to pick up later in our weeks of nuggets. The most important is to check for salience and bias. In other words, to what extent is this right because it's been right before? That person, that project, that topic, this company, it has worked before. So we therefore give it a big tick, a tick far bigger than it's worth. Are we looking at confirmation bias? And this is a very, very common one. This is the easiest one. It's the one I recognize, the one that came in first, the one that comes in from the most senior person. What is the confirmation bias we've attached to this one that could potentially actually be an invalid connection that we're making? Just because it's the CEO's doesn't mean it's right. Just because it worked last time doesn't mean it's right. Just because this company was employed on a different project that they're the right ones now. So watch out for all those confirmations that therefore I know this and therefore I'm giving it a a high credibility because I've put some confirmation attached to it. So what confirmation am I attaching to it? The other one is availability, and this is a common one we see. How many times, and to any FD present, I'm apologizing in advance, but how often is an FD or a chief operating officer put into the job of CEO if a CEO leaves unexpectedly? And they put in as temporary. Sometimes they become the CEO because they're right, sometimes they don't, and sometimes, well, it's the easiest way out. And one of the common things we see in board evaluations is a person who's been promoted outside of their sphere of comfort, and if FD and a CEO are very, very different roles, is the easiest answer is often the worst. Sometimes you've got to go through the difficult process or an interim stage to get to what is right for the organization. The other aspect we need to look at is anchoring bias. I was told something, I see that as a fact, and I haven't checked that real base fact. It's going to make us more money, which is immediately brings on another bias of its own kind. But I've been told something. Have I checked the numbers? Have I looked at the validity? Do they make sense? Or have I just accepted a very, very base assumption that could quite easily not be right? But I have assumed and I've been influenced by that piece of information that I've been given. So think about it, test it, ask for the assumptions, ask for the why, to try and get to the point that you are comfortable that that base piece of information is correct. The halo effect is where we correlate it to something else that has been successful. So that might be something you have done, some project that you've been involved in. Once again, it's very correlated to the confirmation bias. So it's checking that you are not giving it the credibility on an assumption that is not correlated to the current circumstance. And there's also the cost fallacy, which is making sure the facts are correct. Best way to do that one, which is also very similar to our anchoring bias, is if I had a clean sheet of paper, would I do it? Would I do what I'm looking at doing now if I started with a clean sheet of paper? And that is one of the soundest ways to negate some of the biases that we've got, but particularly this cost or endowment one. And there's a whole lot of other really interesting ones that we will go through together next week that do cause various different other impacts. The other questions we want to look at are about the proposal, the project, the person, the appointment, the firing, the promotion, the new business, the investment. It can be all sorts of things that you might be involved in. Is actually to get into it. What is it? And here you're asking the really difficult questions around how, what, why, when, and ensuring that you've got the right kind of information and that you are being given total transparency to make an accurate decision. So let's assume that you've got through that whole process of getting that bit right. Now we ask some of the other questions is, are the assumptions overly optimistic? Have they pushed things into a better light than technically they might be? You know, I think of how many boards that I've worked with that go through a really good exercise in deciding whether to invest. They invest and nobody asks a single question again after that. Where do they go back to assessing whether that decision was the right decision, going back a year later, 3 months later, 2 years later? And one of the important things in decision making and understanding decision making is actually to see what you can learn from every decision you've made, because then you've got some history to look at and to look back at some of the things that you've done. And one of the things boards are very, very bad at, and they are said, well, the numbers are all collated in, we can't extrapolate, we can't separate them, we can't see it separately, which is really a fob off. You can, if you set it up correctly and you do your accounts and your finances and things, you can look at the impact things have. Yes, there'll be grey areas, we absolutely accept that. But also to test whether things have been stress tested properly. Now, most of us say, yeah, I understand what a stress test means. If you've worked in financial services and you see what they do when it comes to stress testing, then you'll get a much better idea of what stress testing is all about. They really, really do that very, very well in terms of just not just the high road, the low road, the middle road, and pray everything happens in the middle. But they will stress test anything from capital to liquidity to interest rates to their assumptions, things, which are all very important things to stress test depending on what the project is. Don't just do one. Depending on what it is, stress test many things and a combination of many things. And most risks come to us because they were the add-on impact of 3 risks hitting you at the same time. Now, the only way you're going to pick that up is to do some accurate stress testing and actually stress test the worst case scenario on 4 or 5 assumptions and then see what happens to your numbers. Now, this is not just a numbers game, it's a spreadsheet game. You need to actually think of it from a business perspective as well and just check what biases are coming into that process. But yes, you need to be able to check what's the worst case scenario, and if it happens, what does that mean? And one of the biases we have is the loss aversion one, which we find it quite difficult for committees, boards, groups of people, person, to actually make a decision to accept a loss. They'd rather see if they can try and get a profit, which is why gambling, logistics, and stats work the way they do. People will try and trade through it or use time to get something to fix itself, rather than sometimes taking the earlier signs of a problem and making the difficult decision than waiting until the hand grenade has gone off. So it's sometimes better to maybe cut that fuse wire before it gets to the bomb. So, and it's trying to assess not to do things too early, not to do them too late. And that's where history, experience, knowledge can influence you both positively and negatively. So that is also very, very important. So that's the one set that comes out of a Harvard review. There's another one that I want to share with you, which is actually by our Financial Reporting Council, which comes from work that was done back in 2013 by the FRC. And they come up with 14 points, which when you read it is just a noise. Doesn't mean a lot to me, just a noise of dumped ideas. So what I did is I pulled those ideas out and I separated them into groups. What's process? What is the direct activities a business can do? And try and make this noise a little bit more meaningful. So looking at that, the ones that are in blue are those are direct control actions that you can take. So once again, we're putting a toolkit in place to be able to stop bias influencing us. One is start early with any project to give people time to absorb. We were talking about fast thinking, slow thinking people. Don't spring things on the board, you'll get a no answer, which is a non-decision. You'll get a non-decision, which will delay, and things will take longer. So respect your team, bring them on board earlier, socialize things in time, and allow their influence, knowledge, and input to form the journey on the way. I'm not going to jump to number 6, the blue ones. I'm going to pick the blue ones up first because they're of a kind. Have a break the decision up into stage points. We covered this in one of our earlier sessions. Don't make a big decision so big that one element, people will dump the whole decision because one element is the part they're uncomfortable with. So break it down and get progress, because as you get progress, so people will be able to change, absorb, and adapt, as does the project and the decisions that you're needing to make. Stage the processes to allow the reflective people to have the time to keep up with you, and create circuit breakers. Create something that will stop something going wrong. So depending on the project, you will have a meeting in the 3rd week of every month to discuss it, because there are some challenges that are coming up, and you have time to sit down and say, I've got a clean piece of paper, let's talk. Give people the opportunity to speak up at this point in time. And the most important thing, which is pretty obvious, is to minute discussions effectively, to minute all the pros and cons, because this will be a learning going back. When you've made your decision and things go right or wrong, there's some point at which those in the governance side can look back at the process you went and make it a learning experience, so that this board will learn from those experiences. Then if you look at process support, you might look at flow charts, flow boards, management involvement. So how do you actually get the various steps integrated that need to happen, and define the challenge processes within the management. So you need the challenge within the decision-making committee, but equally the strategic committee being the board, and how that will challenge them as well. If we jump into 4 and 5, these are not often occurred. Hopefully, under exceptional circumstances, will you need to go for external independent reviews. Those are not things you would kick in a normal decision-making process. This is only when it's a very high value, very unusual, different for the organization, can't get there. You don't trust information. Those are the kinds of reasons why you would fall into 4 and 5 being needed. And then we jump to the red ones, which are mitigating activities. This is very important. This is your, like your 12 questions, this is where you actually just stop and check and double check that you're not being biased in any way. You're not being blind spotted. You're not following the tribe or whatever it might be. And to introduce the devil's advocate like we did in 12 Angry Men. So things we've just talked about all fall into 8, 9, 10, and 11. And the last one, which is also an unusual one that is needed, does need it from time to time, absolutely, but also only under exceptional circumstances where you have to have a sole purpose committee to deal with the issues that need to be dealt with. And sometimes you'll see that around, I saw it as an example in an organization that was having a major complexity with the whole facility they had with their bank. And trying to do this at board level was becoming too difficult because too many people had too many different opinions that were going at a tangent to the project. So they did a special purpose committee to do the deep dive with those with the deep knowledge, and therefore getting the transparency required, and those coming back to the board saying, this is what we've done, this is the information, and bringing it to the board in a way that the board could understand it, because they'd done all the deep information that needed to be collected and the consequences and opportunities being fully debated. Right. The other thing that is critically important now we've got the toolkit is to understand us as humans. So I'm going to race through this because I've taken quite more time than I thought I would. But it's to know yourself. Now, Myers-Briggs is one of them, and we'll circulate these slides. You can, for $93 now, actually do your Myers-Briggs and get quite interesting insights. There's an EQI one that's also really interesting to do. But the most important is to know yourself first. The other thing is to know your opponent. Know how to moderate your own behavior. Don't fly off the handle, and work out what their triggers are. What are the hooks they get hooked on? Manage your knowledge of those hooks so that you don't trigger other people off in any way, and moderate their extremes, but also being very cognizant and respectful of where they're coming from and of their knowledge and how that might be playing into their behavior. So in all ways, being professional and supportive in the conversation, even though you're trying to win it, absolutely you are, but open your ears as well as opening your mouth, because you might learn something and you might change your views on a journey, a direction, or specific pieces of information. This is your Myers-Briggs map, and it can be useful just to understand the 16 components that go into it, or it's the eight components that go into the Myers-Briggs, which creates the 16 different personality types. And if you just understood what the 8 different components are, and people are one or the other, they're either an E or an I, S or an N, T or an F or J or P. So it's getting the pairs and understanding which of the pair they're likely to be. And by understanding what that pair means, you could actually do a lot of this quite unscientifically by just understanding people and understanding how they're going to behave. Another thinking one is, that one was the Myers-Briggs personality style. The next one is the thinking style. People are decisive, hierarchical, flexible, integrative. How do they work their decision making? How they're wired to make decisions? And we're all wired as a mixture of these things in different ways as to how we go about making decisions. There's also four specific decision-making styles that are also referred to, which is innovators, imitators, hands-on, and analytical. So those that are more practical and those that are more thinking orientated, those that need the facts, those that have got the concept. So both of those are important influences in the way people are going to work. And if you know which one your colleague is and which one you are, isn't the journey between the two so much easier if you can get that right? But you have to think in their shoes as well. as your own. You're not the only person in the conversation, you're half the conversation. There are 9 things that I just wanted to put in here quickly that create the wrong decisions being had. One is we've been lazy to go through the process. We just jump to the nearest conclusion. We just say, oh, that's fine, yeah, get on with it, without having thought of the consequences, which is quite important that we do. Not anticipating the unexpected. Now, we know the unexpected comes. COVID's proved it to us. Even though part of the world has understood these kind of things, we all got a big surprise. So think from a risk assessment point of view, we've always been capable of looking at the risks we know, look at the risks we haven't thought of, and think of the unexpected. Being indecisive, I've worked with boards and stuff over the years where they're indecisive around a particular project or a particular person's role. Saw it once with an organization who knew the CEO wasn't effective, knew the CEO wasn't appropriate for the organization, but was just consistently indecisive. And if you mapped the share price of the organization to the point they got to the right decision, which took them about 7 years in the end, you can see the impact directly on the bottom line. Companies and people being locked in the past. You'll see, for example, somebody would say, but you said we were going to get A plus B first. And you said, no, but hold on, the world's changed. I therefore have to change my mind. We're going to get C, D first. But you said A, B would happen first. Not getting locked into what you expected being what's going to happen. Because we all know life does change, events do change, and we have to be agile in the way we receive that information and move forward with the decision-making needed. Something that's got no strategic alignment to the company. How many times do you see somebody running off with a brand new idea? It's absolutely brilliant. I'm going to go and do A, B, and C. Is this what the company should be doing? Is this aligned to our strategy? Is this a completely new strategic direction? Have we discussed it? What is the impact going to be on resources? What is our customer going to think? Are they going to be confused? Very important questions to ask. Having overdependence on any one decision. So if this decision is a make or break decision, or if I'm overdependent on some content in the decision, these are both relevant. Looking at something in isolation, life does not exist in isolation. So how do we make sure that we've blended in the real world and all the other external influences? Not knowing your facts, not having the technical detail, not having sought advice if you should have done because it's complicated. And the other one is people have not communicated the journey and suddenly throw you the result. That one is a very common one we see in boards and does happen regularly over and over and over again. So I've spoken far longer than our allocated time, but we chatted a little bit in the beginning, so I'm going to take my 6 minutes from that basis. So I apologize for that. Next week, we're going to talk about all the different biases, which I mentioned. And then the week after, we're going to talk about what are the toolkits we can take to help us make the most difficult decision, which is around human beings. I've done my bit. I see there are lots of questions, so I'm going to pick that up. This one, people are talking about cognitive diversity. That's a critical aspect in a boardroom environment, is to have cognitive diversity. People who think slow and fast, people who think numbers versus colors, or creativity or entrepreneurialism, those that will be the handbrake to people rushing off on a common thinking point where people are all thinking the same way. So that cognitive differences are fantastic, and diversity will bring us ethnic, gender, global, talent. All those diversities will come with your cognitive diversity as well. So as well as just the way we individually think, the diversities of the people around the room bring another element of cognitive diversity. The other question here is how best to identify structural biases, not based on the individual attitudes so much as culture. Stuart, if I may, I'm going to pick that one up next week. So if we could just make a note of that one, when we start looking at the Cognitive Bias Codex, I will better answer that question without using up too much time now. Very critical, and some of those structural biases are the ones that people really do not get quite often. We talk about a pre-mortem, which actually is a very clever way of working, where you say, okay, I'm here, I'm trying to make the decision. Now, if I make this decision, what will it look like then when I look back? If I make this decision, what will it look like then and I look back? Now, some people can't do that. So that's the first thing you've got to accept. is some people cannot complete that exercise. Their minds can't do that. It's not what they're familiar with. So you have to guide people through their process. And you might find only an element of the team will be able to put themselves into the future based on the current information available with the risks that might be there. That other one is, pass the Sunday Times test is probably a slightly easier way of doing a pre-mortem than a proper pre-mortem, but it's recognizing in this circumstance what the challenges are to it, and therefore not allowing that bias to impact it negatively if that exercise is challenged in any way. We talk about conscious and unconscious biases. Those, again, we're going to be picking up next week. We're going to be talking about those that we're aware of, those that we cognitively have learned, and sometimes they are subconscious because we are reacting and responding to things rather than thinking things through. So again, if I may pick that one up in the next lesson, please. The sunk cost fallacy, absolutely, as we brought that up in the conversation, that is a very difficult one for organizations to admit that there's a failure of some description, and therefore you are cutting the umbilical cord now and not later, and not waiting for it to blow up. But the number of times organizations will deliberate to the point the fuse wire does run out or burn out, and the explosion occurs, the hand grenade goes off. So it is a very, very difficult one to get people to a place before it goes wrong. And when it goes wrong, they sort of say, well, it's not my fault. But their non-decision is their fault because they were making a decision by default. We've covered that quite a bit in earlier. And also one of the questions put forward is, what assumptions have you made in formulating it, which is the business thing, which is in that last section we talked about looking at the proposal, the project, whatever, is actually asking the how, what, why, wherefore, to make sure that first of all, you understand what assumptions they've made. You've also understand why they've made those assumptions and what are the implications if those assumptions vary, which comes down to our stress testing exercise. So really critically important. If you think of that image you saw earlier with the arrows going in all the different directions, the why, what, where, whenever, whatever it might be. And critical to those are actually discussing the resources around it. Might be a brilliant decision, but is it practical? Can we really do it? And I think that's a very important question that often is forgotten to be asked. In economics, self-interest is often assumed as the very basis of rationality. So yes, interesting point. So if you look at behavioral economics that we covered last time, is we know how people might respond to certain stimuli, and we use it in marketing, we use it in sales, we use it in business promotion. But here we've actually got to say is how do those influence decisions in a more micro environment? And they do. Behavioral economics is absolutely part of our decision-making process, because what people have done is they've reached those hooks and you have made decisions, you have responded, or in most cases reacted to the environment around you. The government could do with the following some of these self-interest bias rules much more seriously. It's actually interesting. I've worked quite often with government departments that own companies, and therefore you've got this push-pull of a commercial activity and a commercial board and an owner, shareholder, financier, integrated stakeholder being the government. And invariably they have all four of those roles fitting into the organization. And the net outcome is a disempowered board. Now, I've seen this. I was doing a board evaluation many, many years ago. And the board was so surprised to hear that they should step up and take the reins. They said, but that's not what's expected of us. So that actually is what's expected of you. You're both thinking the opposite. They want you to take ownership, don't trust you to do it, and therefore are taking the reins themselves. Whereas if you took ownership of the board as the board, and you then said, okay, you're an observer in our meetings, that's absolutely fine, you're attending, as government invariably does do, but this is our regulation, this is what we're going to do, we own the decision-making process, you'd be surprised how they'd start letting go because they trust you to run it. Now, at the moment, they don't trust you. The other problem you've got with the government side, having the topic being brought up, is that their education, experience, and knowledge is completely different to those of the board. The board are commercial, they've run businesses, they're in the environment of the product, the project, people, the customers, the stakeholders. Government have invariably had a very different upbringing and have come up through the government ranks. And therefore you end up with this expectation, understanding, and decision-making process that is not aligned at all. And what we typically see government doing, and I've seen this in financial services, I've seen it in the health services, I've seen it in all sorts of environments where the government's been involved, transport as well, where they have then tried to micromanage at every level because that's what they understand is the detail, and they can't be accused of not doing something properly if they had all the detail. But getting all the detail means you're too late to make the decision, which is invariably what happens. Those are all the questions that have come up. We are exactly at our extended allotted time. Thank you very much. Most people have managed to stay on this long. The next topic, we will get into some of the very, very clear issues on bias, which is ourselves, our cognitive biases, and the specific ones that make us behave in specific ways. So quite an interesting one, I think, that we will cover next week. And then again, the following week is how do we help ourselves do the right thing by a person and an organization that we get to the right decisions around human beings. Unless there's somebody who catches me just before we put an end to it. Thanks very much for your time and sharing it with us. I hope it's, as again, has been enlightening in its little box that we've put this little part of the topic, and then we'll pick up a third and fourth box around decision making, because it's actually quite a complex area of what we are as human beings. So thank you. All the best, everyone.